Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I am joined today, and of course, as always, by my good friend and business partner, Jason Johnston Yellen.
Oh, thank you. The truncated introduction this time.
I don't have to always do a full name check, do I?
Not always. Not always, but we've come this far.
Given our age, that's not so bad.
But it's nice to be back.
Yeah. What's new with Jason? What's new in Jason's life?
I, sir, from the moment of this recording, I'm very close to getting on a plane for Scotland.
Oh, that's right.
However, when this recording drops, I will be back from Scotland and in Seattle. But wrapping up my time in Seattle. So I'm kind of looking to the future while living in the present and not really being too sure where I find myself.
So it sounds like you will be in what we'd call a bit of a whirlwind.
Is this to suggest you have been watching My Lady Jane?
It is to suggest I've been thinking about picking it up again. I'm 2 episodes in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
You were no episodes in when I brought it to your attention.
I was 2 episodes in. I was.
You'd seen 2 when I mentioned it to you?
And I told you that I saw it too. Someone doesn't listen to all the words that I say.
I have a hard time believing this. Carry on.
But I've been catching up on various shows. I'll tell you what I did catch up on is, and this isn't a TV show, I saw the latest Alien movie, which...
That is a genre to which you have interest.
I have seen that movie 3 times as of now. That's right.
How long's it been released? A week?
Yeah, it was released, technically, it was supposed to be released Friday, August 16th, but my local theater had it on the Thursday, and I saw it on August 15th. I then saw it 2 days later with Delma, right before she went off to college, which is...
There you go.
Freaking me out. And then I saw it once again with my mom.
My God.
Well, my mother was the one who...
Family affair.
My mother introduced the Alien movie to me in 1978. I was 5. Or maybe it was 79 and I was 6, right? It was one or the other.
Yeah, 5 or 6. We're not going to quibble over it still being wildly inappropriate. But hey... All parents they're walking their own path. All parents are doing the best they can. I don't know what was happening in 1978 or 79. Bless your mother. She's a lovely, lovely, lovely woman.
I've never looked back. I have a picture of me from first grade, and I've got this like brown hair parted in the middle as best I could because my hair was kind of curly, and I'm wearing go figure, right? And I'm wearing a leather vest with a tan turtleneck, and I'm holding one of these. Back in the 70s, they had these 18-inch alien action figures, and you would squeeze their head, and their mouths would open, and the inner mouth would come out and just grab at you like that. And that was like my first grade picture, Jason.
And now you use that same toy to get books off of high shelves.
It's the only way I could do it. I've shrunk, Jason.
What's funny is they're audiobooks off high shelves.
That's the weird thing. It makes no sense. Hear me out, though. Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
So there you go.
Gosh.
I've been catching up on Alien.
That is something else.
You're taken aback.
I remember Alien being pegged as something absolutely horrifying.
Yes.
And I avoided it for the longest time because it's not my genre. Although I used to read a lot of horror and I didn't watch any horror. And so
but what's the disconnect?
I'm not taking any follow-up questions at this time.
I mean, it just seems kind of strange because scary books remain scary. I mean, in some cases, I would argue they can be even scarier because you're dealing with your own imagination and how those stories play out and how everybody looks.
Yeah, I can't give you a reason for why I experienced one media over the other?
You can. Go ahead. That's fine.
No clue. No clue. So I avoided it. And then I finally watched it, maybe as an 18-year-old, maybe as a 20-year-old.
Yeah.
And I just found it incredibly boring.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So you didn't find it scary, you just found it boring.
No, just boring, yeah.
Do you not like science fiction?
Again, I would read a little bit of science fiction without watching science fiction. But yeah, science fiction wasn't really a genre I leaned into either.
Yeah.
So, anyway, this has been Book at Bedtime with Jason and Joshua.
So listen, before we get into our conversation with Lasse from Stauning Whisky, I poured a little bit of a single cask. I got us each a bottle from First Fill Spirits. That's our friend,
thank you,
Holly Sidwan and Charles Grabitsky.
Wonderful.
Out of Saratoga Springs, and they did a single cask rye that was it was a 4-year-old rye, and it's all malted. That's what Stauning do. They do malted rye, which you know how I used to feel about malted rye.
I do indeed.
Our friends at Backwoods have completely changed my mind on that, and now my palate is open. And the cask that they had was, the liquid was distilled in March of 2018, bottled in September of 2022, and it was first matured in New Charred Oak, and then transferred into a tequila cask and bottled at 57%.
Before we jump into the whiskey here, the Danish rye here, I wanted to pause for a second because Holly and Charles have actually been in my thoughts this week.
Okay.
I'm currently reading The Bookshop by Evan Friss. And Evan Friss is actually local to me in Harrisonburg, Virginia.
Oh, that's fun.
And we attend the same synagogue.
Shut up. Really?
And The Bookshop it's published by Penguin Random House. Wow. It was reviewed in the New York Times. Right? And so I'm brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Recommend it. And so as I'm reading it, each chapter he focuses on another long-standing historical bookshop, not bookstore, bookshop.
Oh, right.
And as I'm reading through it, there's a lot of that romance of a bookshop, shelves and books, and people who come in for a book, but they're also looking for community, and they're looking for conversation, and they're looking for recommendations. And as I'm reading through it, I'm thinking, the bookshop. Yeah, I love books. Right? I love bookshops. I'm thinking, what about this for whiskey?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What about walking into that whiskey shop and have your selection be curated and have conversation and be community? And as I'm thinking, wait a second, that's Holly and Charles. That's exactly what they've got going on in Saratoga Springs at First Fill Spirits. Yeah. And so, hey, kudos to them and what they're trying to achieve with that store. And the fact that it has corollaries in other industries and other passions of mine. And so, yeah, I love it when disparate elements come together and you get to think about some special friends. So cheers to Holly and Charles with this Stauning, bottled by them.
Yeah, cheers. That's great. Yeah, so as you were bringing that up, I've been going back to nosing this Stauning, and I'm about to take a sip, but it's one of those weird ones for me. There's notes in here, that sort of grain forward note that is very much so that malted rye that years ago I would even go so far as to say I hated it. I just didn't like it. Mm-hmm. But I think there was a bit hyperbolic. I think really I didn't understand it. And what I should have said is I just don't understand what's going on. And I think, back to our friends, Lee and Bree at Backwoods, who I just mentioned before, where they have a proportion of the rye being malted, right? Allowed me to sort of, that was my foot in the door for malted rye. And then I started exploring the category a bit more, and now I'm fascinated by it, and I'm taken by it, and like you'll hear in our interview with Lasse, each one of the whiskeys that he had at Delilah's when I met him, you know, each one was better than the next, and I learned to appreciate that malted rye quality so much more, especially with him there talking about it, talking me through what I'm experiencing, which I think there's something to be said about not just liquid on lips, but someone guiding you through that process of liquid on lips.
Yeah, I don't think we cover it in the interview, but do you remember what he was pouring at Delilah's?
Yeah, so, well, one of them was the Chaos, right?
Okay, we definitely talk about that.
Poured that. Then there was another one that was a mezcal finish on the rye.
That's not the Stauning Bastard, is it?
I don't remember. I've got a picture somewhere on my phone, but I don't remember.
I have that in my cart.
Did you?
After talking to him.
There you go.
Yeah, I've got the Stauning Bastard, which is the rye and mezcal, and I've got the Chaos, as I said I would.
So what I will tell you is, of the 5, their standard core flagship plus the mezcal were my 2 favorites.
There you go.
There you go. Yep.
There you go.
Yep.
So it was rye and rye that
it was rye and
really
rye, right? But that
to.
mezcal really changed things. So
yeah. Given that you've had the mezcal version and you've had this tequila version, how do the two of those play?
Right. Well, this tequila version, there's no smoke on it, right? There's none of that earthy quality. When I taste this, first off, on the nose, you don't get the tequila. You get the rye grain up front, and you get some of the new charred oak coming through, which is really quite nice. It adds a little bit of vanilla,
definitely getting that
little citrus spice, things like that. But there's that like bread. It's almost like a rye breadiness, which is quite nice. And then when you go to taste it, that's when the tequila comes through. You get some of that like agave syrup along with some of the rye breadiness. Let me take another sip here.
Same.
Great texture. A little bit.
That's
right.
I couldn't agree more on that front. Yeah.
And then it has a little bit of that nervousness on the tongue, that sort of like effervescent kind of quality, which I think only adds to that orange spice that comes through.
The pop rocks kind of feeling.
Yeah, totally. It's funny when Holly sold me this bottle, like she I'll say it here, she pushed this bottle on me, and I told her, I said, malted rye, and I got this last summer. Okay, I got this bottle last summer, and I said, malted rye isn't really my bag. I'm only starting to learn it and enjoy it. And she said, basically, she's so proud of this cask, and I think. Wait a second. I keep on saying Holly here. It must be because the two look so similar. It was Charles that told me about this one. Holly was out of town, so I was with Charles on this one.
Okay. Yeah. Was Charles in charge?
Of our days and our lives or night? Charles in charge of our days and our...
Global audience is loving this.
But it was something he was so very proud of, and I think that he gave me a sip, if memory serves, and I said, I think I need this, and Jason needs a bottle as well, so I got 2 bottles.
I'm glad you did.
Yep.
I'm glad you did. I'm going to continue to enjoy this as well. This is a special cask. They're right to be excited about it.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So,
and you know me, like a bit of citrus shining through always works for me.
I know. And you like that grain forward note. And here's something that I would argue. When you taste this, the Stauning spirit is there. It's there just as much as it is in the flagship. So you really are getting a sense of the distillery, which is quite nice.
Yep. Aspect and an angle that we're always looking at. Always. Yep.
So,
all right. Well, we could keep talking about Stauning,
or we could keep talking about Stauning with one of its founders. So Lasse Vesterby, thank you so much for joining me and Jason to discuss Stauning today. You and I met in Chicago on an absolute chance meeting at Delilah's. I had no idea you were going to be there. And when I walked in and just saw this handsome gentleman with a nice baseball cap and 5 bottles in front of him, it was just a nice surprise. And it was a great way to learn a bit about the distillery, because I didn't know much about Stauning. All I knew is I've had some of your ryes and thought that they were really damn good. After talking with you, I went back home and I did a little bit of research, just enough to be dangerous. And I saw that you guys started in 2005 as a group of friends, just with this idea to start a distillery. I wonder if we can just start there. Let's lay down the groundwork of the idea of Stauning and how it came to be, and then maybe we can let the conversation evolve from that point.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you for having me. It's my pleasure, and great to meet you in Chicago by chance, yeah, but a great, nice meeting. But you're absolutely right. The start of Stauning is back in 2005, and that was also just by chance. And actually, I think you could say that the main reason that Stauning exists is just because of curiosity. Because at that point, nobody in Denmark was actually making whiskey. And my brother Martin, who is also one of the founders, we are 9 founders of Stauning Whisky, he heard this radio show about making whiskey. And in this radio show, they talked about whiskey and production of whiskey. And they said that it's easy to make whiskey. It's just difficult to make a good one. And I think there's some truth in that, because, well, everybody can technically make a whiskey, but it's fascinating how many small and big aspects during the production that have an impact on the flavor. So it's actually just because of that we started to have a discussion, me and my brother, about why not try to make a Danish whiskey. So we had no background in the whiskey industry or in the spirit industry at all. So it was just out of curiosity, why not make a Danish whiskey?
And was the goal to start with rye? Was it to start with malted barley? Did you know where you wanted to start grain-wise?
Well, I to be honest, the very first idea was the inspiration by Islay, Scots Islay whiskey, to make a Danish smoked single malt whiskey. But very soon in the project, and I have to stress out that it was just to have a new hobby. We had no idea of actually making a real distillery down the road, but so the idea was just to have a hobby and meet up and have some fun and try to see if it was possible to make a Danish whiskey. And very soon in the process, it was clear to us that it would make sense for us to make a Danish rye whiskey, because back in 2005, I guess, yeah, in the US, you did make rye whiskey. I guess you're making more rye whiskey today. It's catching up and getting more and more popular, getting more attention. But in 2005, it was kind of the forgotten type of whiskey in the world. And in Europe, well, nobody really knew anything about rye whiskey. And in Denmark, rye is a grain. Well, we have been, the farmers in Denmark and here in Denmark, we've been growing rye for 1,000, 2,000 years. And today, rye is a huge factor in the Danish kitchen. We eat rye bread probably like no other country in the world. So there's a lot of Dane, myself included, is that for lunch, we always have a piece of rye bread for lunch. So in that sense, it just made sense to try to use the grain rye to making a whiskey. And also because that, well, to be honest, just to make, even though that a smoked Islay whiskey was the inspiration and kind of the idea for us, to make a Scotch whiskey in Denmark wouldn't make sense. It had to be something Danish, so it has to be from Denmark. So yeah, so I guess that's why we started also pretty early with the rye.
It's interesting. So up the road from me, I'm here in Virginia. We've got Catoctin Creek. And so Scott and Becky Harris, in producing rye in America, got their inspiration from the Glenmurray distillery in Scotland. And so there's that Scottish impetus, but they went and made a rye, and it fits their environment so very well. And looking into Stauning and seeing you talking about Danish rye, but also Danish peat. And also I was reading Danish heather. Can you talk about your environment? I know you're on the West Coast of Denmark, sitting right on the North Sea, looking west towards Scotland. What's your environment like there?
Well, you fell out just a bit, just to make sure. I hope I got all the question right. Well, where we are living, and actually also one of the reasons why we couldn't see a reason it was not possible to make a good, high-quality whiskey in Denmark, is that the environment here is pretty much close to what you see in Scotland. We are on the west coast. We have salt in the air. Wind is always blowing, so the weather today is pretty nice, but often kind of bad. So we have this coastal climate with salt from the sea in there as well, and wind. So that's the area, and one key, there's a lot of key factors for Stauning whiskey, is that all the grain we're using is local grain, because we want this local, the terroir effect, and the land and the soil out here, it's really lean, so it's good for rye, and it's good for potatoes as well. So we have this kind of rough area. It's flat, it's sandy, it's windy, but it all have an impact on the grain. We're not saying that the grain growing in this local area is the best grain in the world for making whiskey, but it's definitely high quality grain, and it has an impact on the final product where it's grown.
Sure. In talking earlier about setting up distilling and a new hobby, when did you realize you could use local peat source? I know you're talking about being influenced by Islay here, but when did you realize you even had peat locally?
Well, peat is not being produced in Denmark industrial in that sense for like you do on Islay. But there was, in the beginning, we got the peat from a local museum who actually was digging peat and showing people how they did it back in the days for burning peat for making heat in their homes, in their houses. Today we get the peat from a company who dig peat for gardening, because in Denmark peat is not dug for making whiskey, because there are not that many distilleries in Denmark, so that's not an industry on its own. So, but again, it was just crucial for us that starting making a Danish whiskey, and again, just as a hobby, but even as a hobby, it has to be Danish ingredients, because buying some smoked malt made in Scotland, it would just be kind of a Scottish flavored whiskey in Denmark. And the peat we have in Denmark, it is different from the Scottish peat, because it's more floral, and actually, so we get a different flavor. We get like a different smoky flavor when we make our smoked version. Most of our rye is not smoked, pretty much all of them, but the malt is smoked, and it is different. And we also use heather, dried heather, for smoking when we smoke the barley as well. So our smoked whiskey, smoked single malt, is actually a combination of burning Danish peat and Danish heather.
Nice. Wow. Very nice.
Yeah, I was just back to the grain really quick, and to your process as well. You know, you talk about floor malting, but when I go to the website and I look at the malting process, it looks more like a Saladin tub, right? Just a gigantic pool to hold grains with the augers going through. And, I add that plus the 24 alembic stills that you have that seem to be taller than most human beings. And you talk about there not being a history or a tradition of whiskey distilling in Denmark. And it just seems like such a massive operation for 9 guys to put together a Saladin tub, 24 stills, local grains. I'm just curious. I'm not asking you how much money it costs to put it together, but how did you get this all together? Because it's a big dream that you seem to have accomplished.
Well, where we are now is actually the third place we're making whiskey. Stauning Whiskey actually started, if we go back to the very beginning in 2005, in my dad's old butchery, which was very small. But he used to work as a butcher, but he didn't anymore. So he had this small space, 5 times 3 meters, something like that, where we could try and have fun. And this new hobby used the cooling room for doing floor malt, and used where he'd smoked the meat, making bacon or smoked tenderloin. We could use that as a kiln. We actually used the meat grinder for grinding the malted barley and malted rye as well. So that's where it started. And then when we did the first distilling in the butchery and got the first spirit out and figured out this is actually pretty nice.
Yeah.
Then we bought a farmhouse just 3 kilometers outside of the small village of Stauning.
Yeah.
And then renovated that, but making it in the same way of figuring out how to make it, because it actually is floor malting. What you see in the pictures, it is not saline boxes. The thickness of the bed when we lay out the grain is about 7 centimeters. So it is just a floor where the grain just lays really nice and and smooth. So I guess you can say the way we make whiskey in Stauning, the very short version of that is kind of how you made whiskey in Scotland 100 years ago. We just invented our own equipment so we don't get the monkey shoulder by shoveling it. Figured out a solution how to do the very unclear word and direct fired pot stills, which for sure is a challenge. And if you talk about technical aspect, I would not advise anyone to go in that direction, because the risk of getting burned with direct fire and a very unclear word is big, to be honest. But it really has a huge and positive, in our opinion, impact on the flavor. Why? So that's why we are heading in that direction now, or keeping going in that direction, just from the butchery to the farmhouse and now in the new distillery. So it is floor malting, and it is maybe the pot stills looks big, but they are filled with about 1,400 liters each of them. So it isn't.
Oh wow! Okay. Oh, interesting.
So they are rather small, and that's also another. When we get back to the production setup, it's important for us that we still have the small still, so we get the heavy molecule, we get the oiliness in the spirit directly. Yeah.
When you see that number 24, are all 24 in production at the same time? Are they running the same wash through them, so the wash gets divided 24 ways?
Well,
staged.
Yeah, we have it's operated, so we have the 16 wash stills, and they're kind of operated. They could technically just be one big one, but then we would have a different character. So we have one fermentation that is divided into these 16, and then distilling all 16, and then the low wine coming out is then being collected again in the same low wine receiver. And then the next day, that low wine with the head and the tail from yesterday as well is then being distributed into the 8 spirit stills we have. So we have 24 in total. 16 of them are the wash stills, and 8 of them are the spirit stills. Hope it makes sense.
Makes sense, yeah. Wow.
It does? I'm still...
Well, in terms of divisible by 2, and you want twice as much wash still as you want spirit still.
That is very good. Can we talk about your desire to go with the alembic style still over a copper pot still?
Yeah, the reason we have the shape of the stills we have today, again, it's, to be honest, that's a coincidence, because when we started in the butchery and finding a supplier of pot stills there's not that many that made that few, that small pot stills just for a hobby. It was intended in the beginning. So we bought stills that we found, I think, as a Portuguese copper producer. And when the spirit coming out, when we liked that, we just decided to stay true to that shape, so we get the same character when we moved into the farmhouse and again into the new distillery. So that's the reason why it has a shape. And we did, especially when scaling up from the farmhouse to the new distillery, we put in a lot of effort figuring out exactly the specs for the wash stills. They were and the spirit still, because they were slightly bigger, but we wanted to have the same ratio of copper contact. We want to have the same flow of how fast the spirit was running through, so the cooling should be the same. So it was a very interesting process of scaling up without compromising on the way of making whiskey, because when we talk with people in the technical area of whiskey production, everybody said you should just buy 2 or 3, buy 2 big wash stills and then 1 big spirit stills, and you are good to go. But for us, it's just important to stay true to where we came from, to keep the same DNA and get the same spirit as we did from the butchery, from the farmhouse, and now in the new distillery. And we would just have lost that. I used to, it's kind of a tacky sentence, but I used to say that if we just had the other approach, we would just be making more whiskey in Stauning, but we were not making a Stauning whiskey. And for us, it's just so important that we keep making the Stauning whiskey with the character and flavor, and really Yeah, and when we get back to the character and the flavor of our whiskey, our approach on making this rye whiskey and why we are making it the way we are doing is we want to make a rye whiskey that is just as smooth and elegant as any single malt whiskey. Because I met two Americans from Colorado today out in our distillery shop, and they were just luckily blown away with the taste of our rye whiskey. Because, like they say, a lot of the rye whiskey they drink, they are more pepper, more spiciness, kind of gives a burn to it. But like I said, this is just really nice for neat sipping. And that's what we want to make, and that's also why we have made That's why we have made the setup we have today with the floor malt, with the unclear wood, with the direct fire and very small pot stills, because we're kind of handling the rye as you're normally only handling the malt for making a single malt whiskey. But when you do that, you get a nice smooth spirit coming out, also based on the rye as a grain that is smooth and delicate, and really nice for sipping neat as a single malt whiskey.
In thinking about casks, when you go from a sherry butt to, say, a quarter cask, you increase the surface area contact. If you move from a larger still to a smaller alembic still, are you increasing surface area contact there? Are you using copper faster than if you had the larger still?
I don't know if you're talking about the wear of the stills, but definitely the impact on the flavor and the removing of the
both,
sulfur.
actually. Yeah, both aspects.
Well, we're not long enough down the history of Stauning to know if we are wearing down the pot stills faster than we would have, but time will tell.
Yeah.
But we truly believe that for us to have this nice smooth whiskey, it's important that we have a rather high copper contact. And that's also why that's one of the reasons for the small stills, but also one of the reasons we have the condensers that we have. They are tube and shell condensers, but they are the other way around as it normally is. So we have the spirit inside the tubes and the cooling water outside of the tubes, and normally it's the other way around. So Abercrombie, who built the pot stills and the condenser for it, they had to figure out how to do that, because that's how we started out, and that's how we keep doing it. So yeah, copper contact, I'm sure it has a huge impact.
Oh, that's wonderful on the condensers.
Yeah.
One more technical question, if I may be so bold. In this world of direct fire, and clearly Scotland's been moving away from it. We recently, earlier this year, put out a 98 Ardmore.
Yeah.
And so towards the end of their direct fire period. And one of the questions we have been fielding is, why did Scotland move away from direct fire? And sometimes we talk about the inconsistencies. You've got pockets here and there, and it's not all coming out the same way, which for Scotland is against process these days. But then also some talk about the danger of it. If you go to a Diageo distillery, you're not even allowed to take out your phone to take a photo of modern equipment. What's been your experience with direct fire? Is there a danger? You talked a moment ago about potentially burning yourself, but is there a danger within the distillery writ large? And then do you see that inconsistency of pockets of heat? What does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, there's definitely handling direct fire is definitely more challenging than handling steam coils or other ways of doing it, because you just can't control it as accurate. And I guess it's the same if you get back to floor malting. It's the same, but not having the same or more difficult to handle also gives, in our opinion, it gives a broader flavor profile. Mm-hmm. But the main thing for us to have the direct fire is that we hit the temperature hitting the bottom of the pot stills is 600-700 degrees Celsius. I think it's 1,300 Fahrenheit or something like that.
Okay.
So we get this Maillard effect, like when you grill a steak on a barbecue. Yep. Your steak would taste nice also just in a sous vide when it's just nice enough, but you just need that burnt surface to it. Yep. It's kind of the same principle, that Maillard effect you get from hitting the bottom of the pot still with this high temperature. It just adds a lot of some nuttiness, some dried fruit notes into your spirits that you are not having in the same way when doing it in a steam coil. So for us, it's not because it's interesting and romantic and old school. For us, it's definitely because of the flavor. Because to be honest, the challenge in setting up a direct fire pot still, especially with the unclear wort, we had half of a year with pure frustration and just started to operate a new distillery because the risk of getting things burned is just absolutely terrible. And again, working with barley, it's kind of easy. Barley as a grain to do the mashing, the filtering is just nice.
Yeah.
Working with rye, absolutely terrible, to be honest. But when you want to make a malted rye whiskey with the elegancy of a single malt whiskey, our opinion, this is the way to do it. And for us to stand a chance in the world of whiskey, there are so many distilleries out there. There are so many places making absolutely amazing whiskey. So we have to not compromise on quality. Our only chance is to do it the way we think is the right way to do it for Stauning.
Nice.
And to get that Maillard effect, that sort of toastiness or that slight burn to it, does that necessitate the very unclear wort? Have you tried a clearer wort to get that effect with different results that you didn't like?
No, we haven't tested a real clear wort, also because the setup we have doesn't really give us a chance of making a real clear wort. But just the fact that we get more of the protein, we get more of the solid parts into the wort stills. So I would expect that, not that we tested it, that using steam coils in the spirit stills would probably not have a huge effect on the flavor because that it's all clear. You don't get any burns at all in the second distilling. Yeah. But for the wort stills, we for sure will never move away from the direct fire because it has an impact.
Yeah, similar to, I think Springbank do that. They've got direct fire on their wash still, but then their spirit still is a coil.
One thing that was a good experience for me was to meet some guys from Glenfarclas. I actually met them in New York for one trip, and they told the story. I have no idea the details of it, but again, Glenfarclas, they also use direct fire.
Yeah.
And they told that they have tested to use steam coils, and they did some test run, and then they scrapped that and went back to direct fire because they just simply didn't get the character that they wanted from their was still. Using steam coils compared to direct fire. And I'm absolutely sure that they also struggle with handling direct fire compared to steam coils. But when we built the pot stills for direct fire, actually it is interesting that even though Abercrombie is a huge company making a lot of pot stills for a lot of distilleries, the knowledge of making pot stills for direct firing, the people who has the knowledge about that, they're not around anymore. So we were kind of starting over again with the design and how to do it because they don't make direct fire pot stills pretty much anymore. So it's a nice adding challenge to the process.
Just one last question regarding your stills, and this one I have our listeners in mind who they're single malt Scotch whiskey lovers, world malt, bourbon, rye, and making those spirits, it's copper pot stills or column stills where you've got, continuous distillation. And I think many of our listeners understand how these stills work, or at the very least have a basic understanding as to how these work. But when it comes to whiskey, the use of an alembic still is pretty rare. And so I wonder if you could just briefly describe what an alembic still does differently compared to a more traditional copper pot still for single malt production.
Well, I would say it operates in a pretty much the same way because it just is a heat source at the bottom, steam coils inside if you use that, or direct fire underneath. But also we have the onion shape on top of that you see in alembic stills, and that, at least theoretically, it changes the pressure of the molecule going up, so we have something dropping back again. But at the same time, our shape of our pot stills is still very, very low and very fat. So even though we have this onion shape at the top, we still get the heavy molecules getting into the condensers. If you have a very tall and very slim pot still, you get a lot of the heavy molecule just condense and go back down into the wort again. You get it, and you get an even lighter. You can get a really nice spirit, nothing wrong with that. But for us, we would really like to have this heavy, fat spirit that when we taste our spirit coming out directly from the spirituals, it's actually rather pleasant to drink because it just really is rich and fat and oiliness. So you can have this really nice mouthfeel just from the spirit coming out. So that's why we have chosen and staying through with both the shape, but also with the very small size of our pot stills.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't mind, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about the cask end of things. You know, between the U.S. and Scotland, it's the relationship has been there for years where we make bourbon, we can't use those casks again, and Scotland tends to gobble up a good portion of those ex-bourbon casks, those ex-rye casks, and then some other world producers, rum and so on, use some as well. I wonder if you've carried on that tradition, if you're using standard bourbon rye casks. Are there other types of casks more native to your region of the world that you're using to help create some of your flavors?
No, actually, the majority of the cask we're using is from the US, and for our rye whiskey is matured in virgin cask, so it's heavily charged Missouri white oak. We are getting from the US, and for the majority of our malt whiskies is ex-bourbon cask. But then we are adding a lot of 41 wine cask in the mix as well. To adding some sweetness to it. And again, when we look at the rye, because normally you have a rye that's been on a virgin cask, and that's pretty much it. But when you have a spirit, and we do believe that our spirit is really nice and refined, why not play around with it like you see in many single malt whiskies and cask finishes? So that's also why you see on the American market that we have two from our research series. We have an El Clasico and we have a Bastard. And the El Clasico is our rye whiskey beginning maturing on the virgin cask and then ending up in the Spanish vermouth cask. And then just adding that sweetness and the flavor from the vermouth is just, well, as we see it, it's kind of obvious to try to do so because the Manhattan as a cocktail is just amazing. You get the flavor profile, and in the original recipe of a Manhattan cocktail, it's not bourbon; it's rye that's supposed to be the base. So you have the flavor notes from the rye, and then adding just that hint of the sweet Spanish vermouth is it's logical and amazing at the same time. So that's also why our range of rye whiskies, also in the US, will also have some of these cask finishes because, well, if you have a really, really nice rye whiskey as your base, you can really add some nice notes to it with some cask finishes. Hope it makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes great sense. Jason looks like he's got a question that's waiting to jump out his mouth.
Jason's just thinking about making a Manhattan with a rye base right now. And so, as you're talking about the US market here, we're seeing the rye. We're seeing the triple malt, and then we're seeing the smoked single malt over here. Just as you talked about the rye a second ago, would you talk to us about that triple malt there and give us a sense of the inspiration there? What kind of led to that creation?
Well, first, in the future, going forward in the future, the US is going to be more and more rye focused because you guys in the US, you know about the rye, and we can see that it's difficult actually to tell the story about a brand that both have a rye and then a triple malt. I'm getting back to that, and a smoked single malt. So the future releases in the US will be the rye whiskies. But you're absolutely right. We have the triple malt. We call it Chaos. And the reason that it's called Chaos, just a short side story, is that back in the 1930s, I think, we had a Danish prime minister whose name was Thorvald Stauning. Nothing to do with why we are named Stauning. That's because of the small village we are located nearby. But he had this election slogan, choose Stauning or get chaos. And that's the most famous election slogan ever in the Danish language or in Denmark. So it's kind of a saying in the Danish language, Stauning or chaos. So when people, before they started to learn about Stauning as a whiskey, before we started doing that, when people said Stauning, they would just automatically think of the word chaos because it's just an incorporated phrase in the Danish language. So it was obvious for us to make a product and name it Chaos, and not chaotic in a bad way. But what is actually in that bottle is, if you talk to some whiskey expert or connoisseurs, it is kind of chaotic, because what we have in there is our non-smoked single malt, the smoked single malt, and the malted rye whiskey, all in the same bottle. And that's why we call it a triple malt. So we actually have the 3 core spirits we are distilling in Stauning in the same bottle. And it has been quite an interesting process of figuring out how the balance between all of these 3, because if you put in too much smoke, the smoke is just overwhelming, but you need to leave room for the malt itself and the rye as well. So I guess you can say that the triple malt is kind of the essence of all of Stauning, because you have all the 3 base spirits. And it's important, the spirit has not been, they have been matured separately. So we have the single malt maturing mostly in the ex-bourbon cask. We have the smoked single malt maturing in ex-bourbon and some fortified wine cask. And then we have the rye maturing in the Missouri white oak, heavily charged. And then it's when we are batting it together and diluting it, we are combining the 3 of them. So that's what you get in the triple malt. Kind of get 3 malts in the same.
That's such a wild combination, and yet, in a very recent episode of ours, we tasted a product called Lodestar out of Los Angeles, California, and they've taken a high rye bourbon and combined it with an American single malt. And to my mind, to our mind, I don't know anyone else who's doing that. To then encounter you and hear you talking about malted rye meets unpeated barley meets peated. Like, this is wild. Who had that idea, and did other people think that person was completely crazy?
Well, to be honest, I don't know who came up with the initial idea. We probably tested a lot of different ways of doing this, but I think the reason we are doing it is that in Denmark we don't have a history of making whiskey, so we don't have 200 years of history of how you're supposed to make whiskey. So instead of making whiskey how it's always been done, then we can just make whiskey how we think it's both kind of fun, but also when it tastes nice. And for some people, it's a shame to take something as elegant as a single malt whiskey and then add some rye whiskey to it. But when the malted rye whiskey is really nice, and the combination of all 3, when it tastes really good, why not? Why do we want to keep in specific boxes if this product is just a nice experience to taste and drink? So be open-minded. And again, for us, it's definitely been an advantage that we have not been limited by years and years of history of making whiskey in Denmark, because then we can just do it in the way where we find it right for us to make our Stauning whiskey in Denmark.
So that was actually one of my questions for a little bit later in the interview. But since you broach it now, I'm going to jump into this with both feet, which is clearly, and I love what you say, and I love when we encounter producers of any ilk who go down that experimental path, right? And are playing around with flavors and maturation. Your idea of the vermouth with the rye, like, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. When you started to release Stauning and you're walking into rooms where you're presenting a Danish rye to people, a Danish single malt, a Danish whiskey to people, on one hand, you don't have that tradition behind you. How did you find the reception? And how much of that was, Danes don't make whiskey, what are you talking about? Like, was it open arms? Was it a bit guarded? Was it all of the above? What was your experience there?
That was definitely an experience in that people were thinking, why don't we in Denmark just stick to making beers? Because we know how to make beer at Carlsberg, and we've been making beers for many years, and they do a good job, and leave it up to the American, the Scottish, and the Japanese and Irish people to make the whiskey. So there was definitely this reluctance or hesitation. Can it be any good? But once they tasted it, once they hear a story behind it, people were open to it. But I think there was one main event that kind of was a big help for us, for people to realizing that maybe actually the quality of the whiskey we're making is worth to give it a shot. And that is that we were lucky enough that Danish, the food scene in Denmark is rather big and very well renowned out in the world. And the very first restaurant we ever sold a bottle of whiskey to was Noma in Copenhagen. So the first bottle of whiskey we sold to a restaurant was to the world's best restaurant. So just the fact that we could honestly tell the story that the world's best restaurant thought our product was good enough that after the visitors and the guests at Noma have paid quite a bit of money for having a great experience eating their food, they would end up tasting Stauning whiskey. Wow. So the flavor they were leaving Noma with was actually the taste of Stauning. So when people realized that Noma thought, okay, it's good enough for Noma, then it's probably worth giving a shot. But you are right. There was this hesitation. Why? And there still is the hesitation, especially around the age.
Yeah.
Because there is, in the whiskey industry, some people think if it's, and I think the whiskey industry just did themselves a bad favor, is making a history of it has to be 10, 12, 15 to be good. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think especially, well, at least here in the U.S., with the tradition of rye whiskey, a 2-year-old rye whiskey is not unfamiliar to us. You've got the impact of the new oak. You've got that rich, robust spirit from the rye grain. It really is a no-brainer for us here in the States. I wonder, however, for countries that aren't used to rye, your approach there. I like what you said before, where you said, well, the U.S. market, we're going to focus on rye. Okay, what does that mean for the other markets?
Yeah. Well, the other market, it's both going to be rye. We would like to teach the rest of the world about rye. And also that rye can be, again, as nice and smooth and as any single malt whiskey. Mm-hmm. That's also why, I'm sorry if I jump around, but we made a product for the European market in particular. We called in Danish høst. It's a Danish word for harvest, which is actually a combination of our non-smoked single malt whiskey and our malted rye whiskey, because we would like to get people who are interested in the malt whiskey to realize that rye is actually a really, really nice product. So if we give them something that is a 50-50, a lot of people, they realize this is actually really, really nice. So then they may be interesting, and we can see they are in trying the rye whiskey on its own, and not a combination of malted and rye. But back to how it was approached or perceived in the European market with the age where, well, normally people talk about it has to be 10 or 12 years old. It still is a challenge.
Yeah.
I had a nice, interesting conversation with an old, knowledgeable guy from a yeast producer, talking about age as well. And like he said, well, a generation or 2 generations ago, there was a point in having it has to be 12 years old because we were not able to control the process of distilling as good as we are today. So the quality of the spirit coming out 50 years ago was less clean and nice than it is today. But how we can operate today and make it kind of the same, making sure that it is of high quality, the age or the years in the cask, it has to have some year in the cask to give the mellowness to it as well. But it's not as crucial. But the whiskey industry has they just made it normal that it has to be 10, 12, 15 years old to be good. So for us, it's nice when some of the big distilleries are also releasing the young. I think, was it Ardbeg who released the Wee Beasties, who are only 5-year-old? Mm-hmm. It's a nice one. Yeah. So they are pushing the boundaries as well to making people understand that, well, young whiskies can actually be quite nice. And to be honest, I also think that, to me, it's more interesting when you can taste the character of the distillery and not having overwhelmed by the cask itself. So there's also some nice and freshness to it, not being too many years in the cask. So it's definitely a balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep. No, we've worked, 13 years of single cask nation, and we've put in the exact same work. When we launched, we had a 4-year-old Kilchoman, and we thought it was a fantastic representation of Kilchoman spirit, exactly as you're saying. And yeah, some people loved it. Some people were very passionate about it. And some other generation drinkers had said, oh, but if it was 8, but if it was 12, you're like, yeah, but it's 4 and we think it's delicious. It's to us, it's owning the story, and you're clearly owning the story and never apologizing. Like, oh, we're on our way somewhere. No, you're making delicious whiskey and releasing delicious whiskey, regardless of the age.
Yeah, we did we took a chance on a Danish podcast where there are other distilleries in Denmark now, and also some who has whiskey that is more than 10 years old. We also have a few casks of that, not that it's planning for us to make old whiskey, but in that podcast, they asked if they could have some 10 years plus and then try to taste what these 10 years Danish whiskeys was tasting like. And the 2 other distilleries, they gave them some 10 years plus, and we gave them something that was little less than 3 years. And they found ours just as nice and balanced and elegant as the 2 others.
There you go.
And it was a chance to take, because it could have backfired significantly. But it didn't. And it was just to prove the case that if your spirit coming out of the pastels is of high quality,
Yep.
age definitely have a huge impact. And you're not hearing me say otherwise, but it doesn't have to be 10 years.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I would like to hear it from you. In talking with Shilton when he was still representing Paul John, and had this delicious going whiskey, when he tried to sell that locally or present to people locally, there was a sense of, why would we have Indian single malt when we can have Scottish single malt? We want Scottish single malt. And I'm curious, and again, I think I know what you're going to say, but given your focus on local, and given selling this in Denmark, which I understand is a very good Scotch market, have you encountered I'd rather drink Scotch if I was going to drink single malt, or is there an affinity with Danish product and Danish ingredients?
I think in the beginning, people were saying, well, let's buy a Scotch whiskey, and like we talked about before, and then went to see, when this is 10 years old, how they're doing. But I actually believe that the Danish whiskey market is now really proud of both Stauning, but also other Danish distilleries, because we are actually making quite nice whiskey in Denmark. So the Danish whiskey community is loving the Danish whiskey now.
Yeah.
There will always be people who say, well, it has to be a single malt Scotch whiskey, it has to be this and that. And fair enough. And then have them drink the Scotch single malt whiskey. I love Scotch single malt whiskey myself, but I also like to try other stuff, because it just open your mind and experience other things. So there's a bit of both, but for sure, in Denmark in general, the people in Denmark, they are proud of what we are doing, and they like the product we're doing, and they are moving more and more away that it has to be Scottish or has to be Japanese or Irish. They realize that, well, there's a lot of nice Danish whiskey as well.
Well, and certainly, certainly with Noma there, and seeing the rise of the restaurant scene in Denmark, you all seem so focused on local and so proud of local and putting local in front of the world, that to have your distillery, be part of that movement, it makes perfect sense. And so power to you. And I love watching the Danes be so proud of local as well. It's a good thing to be proud of.
Well, it is, and it's just more fun to use local stuff, and also for us, it's just more fun to actually have fingers and the control of every aspect of production, because when we began Stauning Whisky, the easy route would have been just to buy finished malts and then just do the mashing and the distilling process.
Yeah.
But we would never have been able to make a smoked Danish whiskey, because nobody is making a smoked malt in Denmark. So we have to do it ourselves. And to be honest, the malting process, it's just absolutely fascinating, because it's, even though we try to do it the same, but when we do it as floor malting, It will vary from time to time. Just today, it's a little warmer than yesterday, and even though we're laying it out in the same thickness, just 2 millimeters different, it just changes the temperature. So you have to. It really is a craftsmanship. It's absolutely amazing.
It seems like a hell of a task to take on when you are focused on the fermentation and the distillation, to then also be malting. We interviewed a local maltster here again, and this was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and they were saying you have to listen to the crop that comes in. You know, what's the level of moisture when it comes in the door? How does that affect the amount of moisture you add or don't have to add? It sounded like a very, I would say, difficult process, but let's say complicated.
Challenging. So, it definitely is, but at the same time, it's as long as it's also fascinating and you can see that it makes sense what you're doing, then it's definitely okay. And for us, it's been a fun process of, again, with 9 founders with no knowledge about making whiskey, we have also been able to figure out a way of actually doing, for instance, the floor malting in a different way than you see anywhere else in the world. Because normally when you do malting, you have the big steeping vessels where you add the water for 30 or 35 hours to build up the moist content. But because we're doing the way we're doing, and we invented this piece of equipment that will go back and forth turning instead of using the shovel, we're actually doing the steeping on the floor as well. So we build up the moist content on the floor. And the reason we're doing that is that it's much easier to lay out the grain when it's dry. Shoveling and moving around wet grain is more difficult than dry grain. And then when we have this piece of equipment going back and forth, we call it the malt turners, we could just spray. So we are just spraying water for the first 24 hours. And we had a visitor from Colin Gordon. He's now distiller manager at Ardbeg. He used to be operating the Port Ellen malting on Islay. When he saw that in the beginning, he came visit us for a week. I'm pretty sure he thought that we were crazy to do steeping on the floor and not in the. But when he left, he realized that it's actually pretty nice because we get a very, very even moist content in the grain because it's turned at the same time as we slowly add this water. So it really makes sense for us and for us, and that's just for me, it's just a funny story that we are 9 Danes not knowing anything about whiskey. But as we talk now, those pieces of equipment, the malt turners and our principle of doing malting is now being installed in an Islay whiskey distillery in Scotland. It's fun that we are now kind of learning of giving advice to a Scottish distillery of how to do floor malting because they wanted to go back to floor malting as well. So that's just a nice side story.
That's something to be very proud of.
We are. And actually, another thing that makes sense in having floor malting at the distillery is that, well, normally you place the distillery close to a stream, and not just because you needed the water, but you needed to get rid of the heat, the energy. You have to get rid of that from the distilling process. Having a distillery and the malting in the same place, it just makes perfectly sense because we have a rather complex energy setup, so where the excess energy from our distilling process is being kept in a 200 cubic meters vessel, and then we can take that energy and use that for drying down the grain for the malting in the kiln. So it just makes sense to have those two operations close together because the energy you have from a distillery, well, if you don't have a malting, you don't have anywhere to use it. You're struggling getting rid of the energy. So it makes sense to have a malting at the same place as a distillery, actually, in terms of energy.
Yeah,
very smart as well.
Yeah, super cool. So what does the next 5 years look like for Stauning? What does the future hold? Are you going to move into a 4th facility? Like, what are we to expect here?
I hope we are staying in our current distillery for many years. So the next many years will definitely be opening more markets, getting people in the US to taste the product and realize that rye whiskey outside of the US is actually really nice. And again, learning that rye whiskey is nice sipping neat as well when it's done in the way we're doing, and also presenting new products. I know we are, to make a lot of advertising, but I know we are releasing a sherry cask finish of our rye in the US in October, I think.
Oh, nice.
So getting these products out there and educating and learning people that we exist. And well, to be honest, just to get, like we say, liquid on lips, because when I met you, Joshua, in Chicago, a lot of people, they didn't know about Stauning.
Yeah.
But when they tasted it, they really, really loved it. So our biggest challenge is to get people to take the first sip of a Stauning whiskey.
Yep. It makes complete sense. Liquid to lips.
Liquid to lips. It works.
Well, the first person that introduced me to Stauning was Oliver Chilton at Elixir Distillers. The three of us, Joshua, Ollie, and I, were traveling New York, Connecticut, sitting in a bar of an afternoon. He'd said, "Have you tried this? This malted rye from Denmark?" And it's like, okay, if you say so, and then we did, and it was excellent, absolutely excellent. So
thanks, good to hear.
Yeah.
So that's the next year for us. That is definitely to have people to taste it and just realize that whiskey can be made outside of US, Scotland, Japan, Ireland, etc., and also of very high quality.
Yeah. Just one last thing that reminds me of our friends at Backwoods Distilling out of Yakandanda, Australia, and their shirt says, Scotland, Ireland, America, Yakandanda. Just it's great. It's great to see whiskeys being produced outside of the most common whiskey producing countries, and what's nice is we're being presented with new flavors, and not just from specific styles, but like what you're doing with Chaos, where you're mixing a number of things, and you don't have that tradition like you had mentioned that you have to adhere to. You could do what you want because you're a new world distillery. So it's exciting. Stauning has been an exciting distillery for me to discover. I showed you I had this bottle. It was a single cask from our friends at First Fill Spirits out of Saratoga Springs, New York, and I've been enjoying it. I've been enjoying it through the course of this conversation. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us, for telling us about your distillery and your whiskeys. I definitely urge people to explore your stuff because it's damn fun.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been my pleasure. And if you're ever traveling, I know you're probably sometimes in Scotland. You should next time a little further, and then come to Denmark. I'd love to show you around.
Would love.
Can we land at the Stauning airport? Does that have direct flights to Glasgow?
No. Unfortunately, it used to have, actually, because of the oil industry, but now it's just a small local airport with no route flight. But there's Billund, there's also Legoland, so you can get pretty close. I can pick you up in Billund, no problem.
There we go.
We'd love to make it. We'd love to see you. We need to do a European tour with Jess and go to all of these exciting European distilleries that we're learning about. So, pleasure spending time with you. There will be some chaos in my future. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. And thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
So Lasse, thank you again for taking the time out to talk with us. You're in Denmark.
Agreed.
And I think we recorded our conversation at 8:30 a.m. Eastern U.S. time, which was, I don't know, it was an 8-hour difference, 7-hour difference, something significant on a Friday. So thank you for taking the time to do that. And what a lovely thing to have met at one of America's most iconic whiskey bars.
How fortuitous. This is the whiskey world. We've been saying it for a long time now, but these fortuitous happenstances are delectable and delightful, and I'm glad you got to meet them and taste from Stauning, and then we got the chance to follow up with an interview. And now, as I say, I've got a couple of bottles ordered in addition to the one that you kindly picked up from First Fill Spirits for me.
Beauty. Jason, as you mentioned it last episode, we don't have any significant news to be sharing, but we're so close. There's so many bottles on the water. There's so many
really
casks
close.
being bottled for UK, Europe, Asia, and so on. And I'm so excited to be sharing that. We're just not at a point where we can be sharing that. So stay tuned. Listen to further episodes. We're going to have a fuck ton to share with people.
Yeah, it has continued to be a busy summer with bottling and labeling and tasting and sampling and selecting. We're just not showing the fruits of the labor just yet. But once they land in numerous countries, we will be talking about them a lot. But as we always say in the meantime, remember, we have bottles populating the website. If you need a bottle for a party, for a friend, for a gift, we're still your go-to resource for that. Pricing for every budget, $15 flat rate shipping if you want a bottle or two, free shipping if you get over $300. So
right. That's not so bad.
Keep us in mind for your gift giving. It always means the world to us when we hear somebody reach for an SCN to show somebody else in their life how special they are.
Yeah.
And then people write in and say, yeah, I discovered SCN through a gift from a Nation member. You guys are amazing. Your selections are amazing. I love what you do. Thank you to the Nation members who spread the good word of the nation. So, yeah, more to come. Watch this space.
You know what I love? Just really quickly, and you said it there, it's not just us that refers to Nation members as Nation members. Our Nation members call themselves Nation members and really carry that pride and want to share our whiskeys. Like, again, back to our last episode where we talked about this origin story, being a small independent bottler, and now, like you had said, we're releasing bottles around the world. We've created a nation of well over 10,000 members, and they're all proud to be part of the nation, and we're so happy for them to be with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a celebration of the nation as much as it's a celebration of whiskey.
There you go.
But whiskey is what brought the nation together. One nation
Under whiskey.
And, that would make a good name for a podcast.
Listen, speaking of whiskey,
What
did we promise people last episode? Last episode, we tasted the first of two Westland cask finishes, which are, part of their new expanding core range, and that was the wine cask finish. And then we showed restraint. We said we have both of these samples here. We should wait patiently to taste the beer cask finish.
It's not been easy, Joshua.
Yeah. So here we go. I see you've got yours in your glass. I'm going to pour mine into my glass. You ready? Let me see if I can capture the audio. There we go.
Think that got captured by the mic?
I think so.
I was going to say, while you were pouring that, we have in here beer casks of Saison, Stout, Scotch Ale, and Doppelbock.
I can tell you straight off the bat, I am head over heels in love with this nose. It is.
I was busy looking at how oily the legs are on the side of the glass.
It is so bright, and I'm glad you said Saison, right? When I think of a Saison, it's that sort of bright, tart quality that comes through in a Saison. And I'm getting a bright tartness.
Yeah. And you've got Westland themselves using a Belgian beer yeast in fermentation for the very whiskey that goes into these ex-beer casks.
You know what I like? Just in general, this expansion of their core range, highlighting wine, highlighting beer. And it kind of ties into something that they said a year ago, 2 years ago, where they were going to be stepping away from sherry casks a bit, is they're leaning into more locally sourced materials to make their whiskeys. And the fact that they're using local wine producers, local beer producers, I think is so smart. It's so cool. It fits with their, it fits exactly with what they do, right?
Yeah, local grain. Yeah, and I think it fits lovely in the episode we've got with Stauning, where we just talked about local in that interview.
Yeah.
It's nice to see those crossovers. It is interesting, and I know Lasse said it in our interview, but Westland have got this on the information cards that came with the samples. Every batch, and we talked last time about these being batch releases, that will change a little bit. There'll be subtle differences from batch to batch, but there will not be broad stroke changes like you see in the Outpost series.
Yeah.
But in the card they say every batch uniquely expresses the region's distinctive terroir and cultural tapestry. And what did we just hear from Lasse today?
Right. You weren't kidding about the legs. As you were reading that, I gave this a swirl, and I'm looking at the legs, and they're wide and they're slow to go down the glass.
They are indeed.
They're thick.
Yeah. Lovely. Yeah, I haven't even tasted it yet. I'm just looking at the oils and sticking it in front of my nose. How bright it is remarkable.
So, question: does it talk?
Oh, yes.
Does it talk about the base spirit? I'm not necessarily getting a lot of chocolate going on here. Is this Washington Pale?
I was going to ask you the same question.
Okay.
Which is, given the color on this, it's very brightly colored. It's gold verging into yellow. Oh, it's so bright that I wondered if this could maybe be Washington Pale Malt as a base.
Yeah, but I mean, spirit comes off the still clear regardless of what malt you're using. So I don't think color is that indication.
Yeah, but I always think of that chocolate malt. Clearly this is I haven't done it in a long time, but as the brewer in me kind of leans into that chocolate malt and that heaviness, I think of the pale malt that has very bright flavors being very bright in color. And I think of the 5 malt having those heavy flavors being darker in color.
That's our minds playing tricks on us. It totally is.
Right?
Yeah.
Same as when I have rye, I often think of brown spice.
Yeah.
And rye gives me a kind of a brown idea in my head when I'm tasting it.
So I'm nosing it a bit more, and I don't know if it's me convincing myself or otherwise, but I feel as if I'm getting something heavier going on the more that I nose this. I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm getting, gobs of chocolate, but I am getting something a bit deeper beyond that initial brightness from what I'm assuming, is beer cask driven.
You think you're getting a grain note deeper than that?
I think I am. I think I'm getting, and it could be the double Bach, right? The double Bach can have that heavier, malty.
Heavier.
I guess we're gonna have to taste it, Jason.
I know we haven't even gone. Okay.
All right, here we go. You're sipping. While you're sipping, I'm gonna continue nosing. Yeah. Okay.
You also have stout going on in here. Stout for the beer casks. Just like I did in the last episode, I took advantage of my text connection with Anna at Westland.
Yep.
And I asked if the beer cask is built on the back of Washington Pale Malt. And she says 83% Pale Malt, 17% 5 Malt.
See, there you look at that. So I seem to recall you and I at some point asking our friends at Westland if they ever married together just the straight up Washington Pale Malt with the 5 Malt. And I think at that time it had been thought about, but they hadn't executed it yet. So here we go. They're mixing spirit types. I love this. Oh, I love this.
And while I had our attention for this episode, I revisited. Remember when we were tasting the wine cask in the last episode, and we thought it was really 5 malt driven, and we got that kind of chocolate note driving through it?
Yeah.
The wine cask finish is 60% 5 malt and 40% pale malt.
I'll tell you, if anything, at least our palates work, right? We can detect sometimes, right?
Sometimes.
But I do like. But interesting on the wine cask one. I wonder if those wine casks helped to amplify that 5 malt,
100%.
right?
I think the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then this 83% pale malt with Saison, but even stout, Scotch ale, and Doppelbock. You're looking at pretty malty profiles there.
So
Saison, I think, more of yeast driven and maybe spice driven.
100%. I am not necessarily. I think I may be getting some of the maltiness from the Doppelbock, but I'm not certain I'm getting much of the stout coming through. Are you getting that on the nose or the palate?
I wouldn't feel confident saying no, because it could be manifesting in a way that's not obvious, or it could be kind of marrying quite nicely with the Scotch ale, with the Doppelbock.
Right.
I just I think that's really fucking wonderful.
It's really, like, if I'm being very honest, I liked that red wine cask quite a lot.
Agreed. Absolutely.
And I'm going to get a bottle, and just, it's Westland, right? This is what we do as Westland fan people. But this one is ticking the boxes and then ticking them again. Like, I'm really, it almost reminds me, not so much, but the fascination that I'm feeling with this is quite similar to the fascination I felt with the Jack Rose Mezcal single cask, right? Where it's just doing something that other Westlands aren't doing. And I like that.
Man, I'm still thinking seasonality to a degree. When we talked about the wine cask, we thought sweater weather, we thought about maybe by a fire, maybe indoors or outdoors. For this beer cask, we're sitting here recording end of August, the episode's going live the beginning of September. We're in warmer weather. We've got the sun shining. We're in short sleeves. And this just fits my mood right now perfectly.
Yeah.
I would crush this. Hashtag, please crush the entire bottle responsibly. But again, when you bring up the Jack Rose Mezcal Westland, we hashtag responsibly crushed half a bottle of that when we had it together in Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah.
I feel the same way about this release as I did about that one, which is one glass leads to 2, leads to
4,
3, leads to responsibility.
It's 1 for you, 1 for me. 2 for you, 1, 2 for me. 3 for you, 1, 2, 3 for me. Like, I agree with you on the seasonality. Like, I get that approach, but the past few nights here in Connecticut, it's been getting down to the low 60s, upper 50s, and lighting a fire on my back deck, or not deck, but my back patio, bundling up a little bit. Like, I could have this in my glass, little music playing in the background, and just bullshitting with Haida and friends. Like, I would perfectly enjoy this in sweater weather. Like, happily enjoy it in sweater weather.
Oh, I'm not saying it goes away, but I think right now with that Washington Pale Malt and with that beer component to it, doing this in a half and half would crush. Absolutely crush.
Can you explain to our American listeners what a Hoff and Hoff is?
A dram next to a half pint of beer. Where you're not overwhelmingly pouring either one of those, but you're moving back and forth between the two of them. It's an expert way to drink.
I just got the stout. It comes through as this sort of like soft, grainy bitterness, which is really nice. Yeah.
When you say soft, grainy bitterness, would that differ from a dark chocolate bitterness or a cocoa bitterness?
Yeah, it would. It's I get it every time I pour a Guinness. It's slightly, it's like a metallic bitterness, but it's so pleasant and drying, right?
I know exactly what you're talking about. I know exactly. Although I think maybe in Ireland they would say that's the downside of it coming in cans and not, being next door to the distillery coming through pipes.
Yeah, it only comes in cans over here.
So I had to do something that I was suggesting I was going to do in the last episode, but I've done it this time.
Shit.
I just went ahead and poured the flagship sample.
Oh, did you? Oh, let me do that too. All right.
Yeah, because there's the wine and there's the representation of the 5 malt in there. There's the beer and the representation of the pale malt in there. And now for flagship, I thought, let's clear out the wine casks and let's clear out the beer casks. Let's see what's going on. To be clear, all 3 of these are the new line from Westland. All 3 of these are 46% alcohol. All 3 of these should be found in good whiskey stockists.
And if they're not in your local whiskey stockists, I would argue you should ask them to get it because it's Westland, right? Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, so I just poured myself a little bit of the flagship. Oh, there you go. So what was the reason? What was the reason for pouring flagship?
Oh gosh.
Are you looking for that connective tissue?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
If this is Westland with wine casks and this is Westland with beer casks, what's the flagship without those 2 areas of focus? Which actually has me running off to the Westland website here, because I was suddenly curious. Mm-hmm. So what casks are in the flagship? And to the point we'd made in the last episode where Westland used to be 3 releases, the American Oak, the Sherry and the Peat. Mm-hmm. Now to see what's the makeup of flagship. And so the cask types in flagship are New American Oak, Used American Oak, First Fill Bourbon, First Fill Oloroso Hoggies and Butts, Second Fill Oloroso Hoggies and Butts.
Yeah.
And then the grain bill is the pale malt, and then the 5, including, there it is, brilliant.
Peated.
Baird's heavily peated malt is in the flagship.
What I've always liked about this flagship, this new, I mean, I say newer, but maybe we're in the second year or so of it being, Westland's core product. What I like about it is they basically took the 3 original core products and Voltroned them and just said, look, we do these 3 things. Let's just put it together and say, here's what Westland does in a nutshell. And one of the things that I find interesting, tasting this in context with the beer cask, is that the smokiness, that Baird's heavily peated malt really comes through when you compare and contrast with this beer cask.
Yeah, and I remember we talked about this when flagship was first launched, and I was excited to have those 3 Voltroned, as you say, and I just forgot that it's got that smoke in it. And so revisiting, I think it's when we recorded the extra. I think I said I needed a bottle of this, and I'm trying not to bring in new bottles and clearly failing miserably, so I might as well fail miserably and add a flagship to my Stauning order.
It's so difficult to not bring in new bottles when people continue to make great whiskeys. Like, I'm glad people aren't making that decision with our whiskeys, because we continue to bottle whiskeys we think are excellent. So please, don't follow Jason's lead. continue buying all the
No,
bottles.
no, keep buying. No, do follow Jason's lead, who is still buying new bottles.
There you go.
Despite not meaning to.
So-
Don't tell my wife. She doesn't listen to the podcast.
So what's the connective tissue between Westland Flagship and Westland Beer Cask Finish, or red wine finish, if you want to bring that into the mix?
Yeah, I think there is a precision to how Westland uses grain. And I think the fact that you and I can sit here and get more or less the grain component of the wine cask correct,
Yep.
and more or less, way more than less, the grain component of the beer cask right, and then have the flagship where you're like, that feels like all of them going on in there, including a bit of the peated barley.
Yeah.
I think that attention to detail on barley is the connective tissue through these Westlands.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
And then you have the beauty of bouncing off to explore it in wine, to explore it in beer, to explore it in bourbon and sherry. Yeah, that's and New Charred Oak, of course. Gosh, they're good. They're
Good,
just
right.
good.
They know what they're doing. That's very clear, right? I'm so glad we discovered them 10 years ago. Started bottling their whiskeys 10 years ago. Continue to bottle their whiskeys throughout the years, and will continue bottling their whiskeys. It's right. These guys are a favorite of mine. I know they're a favorite of yours.
Oh hell yeah! Gosh,
Yeah.
that is not up for debate. And then there's Jess, who takes that fandom to another level.
Yeah. I always,
She's gonna crush that beer cask.
I
Her and
always
Sweet
say
Scott.
that Travis Williams is the Jess Lomas of Kilhoman, right? Jess Lomas and her love for Westland is the stuff of legend, and yeah.
Gosh, I'm just sorry. I'm just looking at these 3 samples on my desk. Yeah, well done on that front. Really well done. Yeah. Thanks again to Anna for sending those out, for answering questions when being texted live during the recording.
Did you say like fuck it, we'll do it live? Fuck it, we'll do it live.
Okay. We'll do it live. Okay. We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
I didn't have to. She was already responding. She's terrific.
Thanks again to Lasse from Stauning Distillery out of Denmark. Your whiskey remains fascinating. I know Jason just ordered or is about to order 2 more bottles. Learning about your distillery, I think, was lovely, and hopefully our listeners will seek them out. Thanks again, like you had said, to Anna Hins from Westland, to you, Jason, and of course, to our nation members and to our One Nation Under Whiskey listeners, which are not always one and the same.
Correct. They could join up, though.
They could, right? It's easy. Singlecastnation.com. All you do is start an account. And guess what, Jason? It's free. It doesn't cost a dime.
My favorite number.
There you go. So, cheers. Cheers to you and to everyone.
And to everyone.
To everyone and everyone. I think you gotta like clink the top of the glass.
Nope, you complain about that every time.
Oh, that's
See?
worse.
That's why you complain every time. That's nice. It just doesn't reverberate because you're holding it as the
Well, there's that.
Dune side.
Dune. everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation with One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I am joined today, and as always,
You're keeping that?
oh, you know I'm keeping it. I got to keep it because I'm joined by you, Jason, Neil, Patrick.
You are joined
Harris.
by Jason.
Yes, I am. Jason.
Hello again.
Hello again. It is
It
absolutely.
has been too long.
It has been 3 long, Jason.
Like 5 shadowing in a story. You're watching a movie where the plot is so transparent. It's not just foreshadowing, it's 5 shadowing.
There was a great like Moyle joke about a 5 skin rather than a 4 skin. I'm not going to tell it here. The joke just fills it, it just told itself, really.